That's not what I meant. That's how it started in my head. Not out loud. Just that small correction hanging there while everyone else kept talking. We were standing in the driveway. Late afternoon, one of those neighborhood things where nobody says it's mandatory, but everybody shows up anyway. Someone had dragged out folding chairs. Someone else brought lemonade in a plastic pitcher. The sun was low enough to make the concrete warm through my shoes. I remember adjusting my purse strap. That's what my hands were doing. Adjusting, then adjusting again, like I needed to keep them busy. My son-in-law was leaning back against his truck, arms crossed, smiling the way he does when he thinks he's being charming. Someone had asked about the new rules the HOA was rolling out. Parking, trash bins, lawns, that sort of thing, and he laughed. Not loud, just enough. Then he said it. She doesn't really understand how things work around here. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Everyone looked at me anyway. I felt my face do that thing where it tightens before you even realize you're embarrassed. I smiled. I always smile first. I've done that my whole life. It's a habit you don't even notice until it's already happening. I said something small back. I don't even remember what. Probably a joke about being old-fashioned. Something to smooth it over. They laughed. Or maybe they just nodded. Hard to tell sometimes. The conversation moved on. It always does. But I stood there a second longer than I should have, watching them turn their bodies slightly away from me. Not rude, just angled, like the circle had shifted, and I was suddenly on the outside edge of it. That was the moment, not the joke itself. The ease of it. The way he said it like it was already understood. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was being sensitive, that neighbors don't mean anything by these things. I've lived long enough to know better than to make a scene over a sentence. So I stayed quiet. I stayed for the rest of the gathering. I complimented someone's flowers. I listened to a story about a dog getting loose. I laughed in the right places, and when it was time to go, I hugged my daughter, patted my son-in-law's arm, and said I'd see them soon. All normal, all fine. But on the drive home, I noticed my hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Just a little, not enough to be alarming. Enough to notice. I kept telling myself it was nothing. I've raised children. I've worked jobs where people talked down to me every day. I've learned to let things slide. Still, when I pulled into my driveway and sat there with the engine off, I didn't get out right away. I just sat. The house was quiet when I went in. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your own thoughts sound louder than they usually do. I put my purse down, took off my shoes, went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, even though I wasn't really thirsty. That sentence kept replaying. She doesn't really understand how things work around here. I tried changing the words in my head, making them sound kinder. Like he'd meant it as a joke. Like he'd been protecting me from something. Like he'd been speaking for me. But no matter how I rearranged it, the meaning stayed the same. You don't belong in this conversation. You don't need to know. We've got it handled. I've heard that tone before, just not from him. I leaned against the counter and stared at the sink. There was a plate still drying from breakfast, a coffee ring on the counter I hadn't wiped up yet. Ordinary things, comforting in a way. I told myself I was tired, that I should rest, that tomorrow it would all feel smaller. And maybe it would have if that had been the only thing. But it wasn't. Over the next week, little moments started stacking up. Quiet ones, easy to ignore if you weren't paying attention. A notice taped crookedly to my mailbox about trash bins being out too early. I'd followed the schedule. I was sure I had. But I shrugged it off and adjusted anyway. A comment from a neighbor about my hedges. Not unkind, just pointed. The HOA's been stricter lately. A group text I found out about later. My daughter mentioned it casually. Oh, the neighbors have a thread for updates. I wasn't on it. I told myself that made sense. I wasn't on my phone much. I didn't need more notifications. It was probably nothing personal. Still, I felt something shift. Like a door I hadn't noticed before was now closed, and I was only just realizing I used to walk through it. Before we continue, if this story resonates with you, comment below how it made you feel and where you're watching from. Your support helps stories like this reach more people. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I tried talking to my daughter about it once. Lightly, over coffee. I mentioned the mailbox notice, the group text. She waved it off. It's just how things are now, Mom. The HOA's gotten more organized. More organized. That phrase sat heavy with me, like something neat and tidy that didn't leave much room. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't want to sound defensive. Or worse, confused. That's the thing people don't tell you about getting older. It's not that you stop understanding things. It's that people start assuming you don't. And sometimes you let them because it's easier. I started paying closer attention after that. Not in a suspicious way, just listening more carefully. I noticed how decisions were being made before I ever heard about them, how information reached me secondhand, filtered through someone else's explanation. I noticed how my son-in-law would speak for me in conversations. She's fine with that. She doesn't need to worry about it. I didn't correct him, not then. I told myself he meant well, that he was trying to be helpful, that I was lucky to have family nearby who cared enough to step in. But late at night, lying in bed, I'd think about that laugh in the driveway. The way it landed, the way no one questioned it. I started pulling out old papers, HOA bylaws I'd tucked away when I first moved in, notices I'd skimmed and forgotten. I told myself I was just decluttering. Still, I read them. Slowly, carefully. It felt strange doing that. Like I was preparing for something without knowing what. I didn't tell anyone I was doing it. The next neighborhood gathering came and went. This time, I stayed on the edge by choice. Listened more than I spoke. Watched who spoke to whom. My son-in-law caught my eye once and smiled. Friendly, easy. I smiled back, but inside something had gone quiet. Not calm, just watchful. That's when I realized this wasn't about the HOA at all. Not really. It was about being decided for. And standing there in my kitchen later that night, papers spread out on the table, I had the unsettling thought that I might have been agreeing to that for longer than I wanted to admit. I folded the papers back into a neat stack and slid them into a drawer. For the first time, I wondered what else I'd missed while I was being polite. And that thought didn't let me sleep. I didn't do anything right away. That's important. I need to say that. Because later, when I look back on this, it would be easy to pretend I saw everything clearly from the start. That I knew what was happening and just waited for the right moment. But that's not how it felt then. What it felt like was standing in a room where the furniture had been moved an inch or two overnight. Everything was still there. Nothing was obviously wrong, but you kept bumping into corners that used to give you space, so I kept living my days the same way. I watered my plants in the morning. I walked the block in the evenings, waving at people like I always had. I went to the grocery store on Tuesdays because that's when the produce was freshest. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inside, I was cataloging things. Not deliberately at first. It happened the way it always does, one small detail at a time. Like the way my daughter started answering questions I hadn't asked yet, or how my son-in-law would say, "We already checked on that," even when I hadn't mentioned needing help. Or the way neighbors stopped asking me directly and instead said, "Oh, your daughter said you were okay with it." Okay with what, exactly? I began noticing how often my name was being used in decisions I hadn't been part of. I told myself this was just how families work, that I'd raised my daughter to be capable, decisive, that this was the natural order of things shifting. Still, there were moments that didn't sit right. One afternoon, I came home to find a note taped to my door. HOA letterhead, very official looking. It said something about a compliance reminder, landscaping, visibility from the street. I stood there reading it twice, then a third time. I knew my yard wasn't perfect. I also knew it wasn't out of line. I'd lived here long enough to know what actually got enforced and what usually slid by. I folded the paper and went inside. That evening, my daughter stopped by. She brought leftovers, set them on the counter like she always did. "Oh, did you get the notice?" she asked casually, like she was asking if I'd checked the mail. I told her yes. She nodded. "We figured. The HOA's been cracking down. Don't worry, we'll take care of it." "We'll," that word again. I asked her what she meant. She hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Then said her husband had talked to someone, that they'd explained things, that it was better if they handled communication going forward. Just easier, she said. Easier for whom? I didn't ask that out loud. I thanked her for the food, told her not to worry, said I'd look into it myself, She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You don't have to, Mom," she said gently. "You don't need that stress." That night, I lay awake longer than usual. I kept thinking about stress, about how often people decide something is stressful for you without asking. I remembered being younger, being told not to worry about finances, or repairs, or plans, because someone else would handle it. Back then, it had felt like relief. Now it felt like erasure. I started reading everything that came through my door, not skimming, reading HOA updates, meeting summaries, little bullet points that most people ignored. I didn't tell my daughter I was doing this. I didn't tell my son-in-law. It wasn't secrecy. Not exactly. It was privacy. There's a difference, even if it took me a while to remember that. One morning, I went for my walk earlier than usual. The street was quiet, sprinklers clicking on and off. A neighbor was out front, fiddling with his mailbox. We exchanged pleasantries. Weather, his back acting up, the usual. Then he said, "Your son-in-law's really on top of things with the HOA." I paused. "Oh," I spoke. "Yeah," he replied. "He's been pretty vocal, at meetings and all, making sure everything stays uniform." Uniform. I nodded slowly. That was the first time I heard about meetings. I didn't say anything else. Finished my walk. Went home. I stood in my kitchen afterward, hands resting on the counter, and felt something harden into place. Not anger. Clarity was closer. I thought back to that first gathering. The joke, the laugh, the way he'd spoken for me. I started connecting things. The group text I wasn't on. The notices addressed to me, but discussed with everyone else. The decisions already made. It wasn't malicious. I could see that now. Or at least, it didn't start that way. It was convenient. And convenience has a way of turning into control if you don't interrupt it. I opened the drawer where I'd put the papers before, took them out again, spread them across the table. I read about procedures, about complaints, about responses. I noticed who could file what and how. I noticed timelines, requirements, language that looked complicated at first, but wasn't once you slowed down. I felt something shift then. Subtle, but real. If you're listening to this, and you've ever felt quietly moved aside like this, you already know the feeling. That moment where you realize confusion isn't the problem, lack of information is. And information can be found. I didn't decide anything yet, but I stopped doubting myself. The next HOA notice came a week later. This one was addressed more formally, more firm. I read it once, then again. It referenced a complaint, not a warning, a complaint. I checked the details, dates, descriptions. Something didn't add up. The description was vague, but the timing wasn't. It mentioned a conversation, a request, one I'd never had. I sat down at the table. This time, my hands weren't shaking. I thought about asking my daughter, about confronting my son-in-law, but I didn't. because I realized something important in that moment. If I went to them first, I'd still be asking for permission to understand my own life. So instead, I made a list. Just facts. What I knew. What I'd been told. What I hadn't been included in. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was steady. I started attending HOA meetings. Quietly, sitting in the back, listening. No one objected. No one even seemed surprised. That was telling in itself. I heard my son-in-law speak, confident, assured, talking about standards, about consistency. He didn't mention me, but I heard my situation described, abstractly. As an example, I watched heads nod, and for the first time, I felt something like resolve, not to embarrass him, not to expose anyone, just to stop being discussed like an item on an agenda. After the meeting, I walked home slowly. The night air felt heavier than usual. I thought about all the times I'd stepped back to keep the peace, all the times I'd let someone else take the lead because it seemed easier. I realized then that I wasn't upset about the HOA. I was upset about how easily I'd been removed from my own decisions. That night, I didn't sleep much, but not because I was anxious, because I was thinking clearly. By morning, confusion was gone. In its place was something steadier, something quieter, awareness. And once that settles in, it doesn't leave easily. I picked up the phone, not to call my daughter, but to ask a question I should have asked sooner. And as the call connected, I knew this wasn't going to stay quiet much longer. The woman on the phone spoke slowly. Not because she thought I wouldn't understand, but because she was used to people being upset when they called. You could hear it in her voice. That careful, neutral tone. I wasn't upset. I asked her to explain the process again. What counted as a complaint? Who could submit one? How responses were logged? What happened next? She answered every question. When we finished, she asked if there was anything else she could help me with. I said no, and I meant it. I didn't act right away after that call. I made lunch. I washed the dishes. I sat at the table for a long time, looking out the window at the street. Cars passed. Someone walked a dog. Normal life. That was important to me. Keeping things normal. I went back to the drawer, took out the papers. This time, I didn't read them all again. I already knew what they said. I filled out the form. Carefully, neatly. No extra words, just facts, dates, descriptions. Copies of notices, notes from meetings. I didn't accuse. I didn't speculate. I didn't add feelings. I signed my name. When I slid it into the envelope, my hand was steady. I mailed it myself, not because I didn't trust anyone else, because it was mine to do. The days after were quiet. No sudden reactions. No angry phone calls. No dramatic confrontations. That's how real things usually are. They don't explode. They shift. I noticed my daughter didn't bring up the HOA for a while. When she did, she sounded careful. My son-in-law stopped speaking for me in conversations. He asked questions instead, short ones, neutral. At the next HOA meeting, the tone was different. Not tense, just more measured. My situation wasn't discussed at all. Afterward, one of the board members stopped me on the sidewalk, thanked me for my thoroughness, said it helped clarify some procedures. I nodded, said I was glad. That was it. Later at home, I made tea and sat at the table. The same table where I'd felt so unsure weeks before. I thought about how close I'd come to believing I was the problem, that I was confused, behind, in the way I wasn't. I had simply gone quiet for too long. That night, my daughter called. We talked about ordinary things, weather, groceries, a neighbor's new car. Before we hung up, she paused. Next time, she said, we'll check with you first. I said okay. Not because I needed permission, because it was enough. I didn't win anything. I didn't prove anyone wrong in a way they'd remember forever. What I did was smaller. I stepped back into my own space, and that has stayed with me. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel. These stories reach the people who need them because of support like yours.